Hello and welcome back to the Commonplace Podcast. My name is Autumn Kern and I love books. I love books so much. Books are windows to other worlds, to other times, to other places, to other experiences, and all sorts of good adventures. And today we are going to talk about 7 books that I would like you to consider reading this summer if you are a classical Charlotte Mason home educator in order to understand how different classical education truly is from our modern educational systems. So if you're like me, you probably have a lot of people asking you how your school year is going, how your child is reading, probably trying to play a couple Jedi mind tricks on them to see if they're actually as smart as homeschoolers claim to be, different things like that. And what often happens to me is that someone will say, oh yeah, my kid is doing the exact same thing at school. And if they're not at a classical school or a Mason Cottage school, I am very suspicious that they are doing the same thing at their school. And here is why. Classical education is built on a pre-modern view of the world, and we, my friends, do not live in a pre-modern world anymore. We live in a modern world. We have modern minds. We are modern men. And it is not the same thing. And I can get very flustered internally when I try to explain this to people in under a minute, because usually no one is really buckling up for like a 20-minute explanation from me when they ask these questions. But it's very hard to explain that no, that it's not just that your child is in first grade and my child is in first grade, so they're doing the same thing. Because it's not that. The roots, foundational elements, all of the goodness of a classical education is actually so wildly different than a modern education that it can feel like you don't even know where to begin. But this stack of books here will help you sparse some ideas out. And here's the thing. Are any of my book suggestions ever on the nose suggestions? They are not. It's kind of my thing. In fact, I don't think you really want that. And here's why. Because we as moderns do think we want the copy and paste. We just want to know the answer. I'll get to the why later. Just tell me how to do it. Tell me what the answer is. We actually don't want that. It's very boring for our minds. It's not that engaging for our imaginations, and then our hearts kind of wither. We don't love the thing. What we want to do is to be taken on the journey. The going on the journey of the humility of the learning is actually the people thing that we were made to do. And so when I give these book suggestions, it's gonna ask a good bit of you, but that means it'll probably develop a good bit in you. And so while none of these are going to be like, here is what a classical education is, and here's what a modern education is, they will invite you into some part that I think is foundational to classical ed and contrast it to the way the modern view does this. Like, it's so much more fun. So let's get started. So my first book today is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And this is written by Dr. Trueman. He is now actually a professor at my alma mater. I am sad that we did not cross paths. However, this is an excellent book to understand how we got to where we are today. In fact, he opens it up with a rather hot statement saying that this phrase would have never meant anything to his grandfather's generation. And that phrase is, I am a woman trapped in a man's body. That they would not have had any framework to process that the way that we would now understand what a person was trying to say. And so through this book, he looks at a lot of different things like the philosophical growth of expressive individualism. And he also goes through the sexual revolution, which these things, self-identity and sexual nature, are often very tied together. But anyways, I want to do what I did in my last book video, which was give you an inspiring idea from each one so that hopefully you will want to go and read it. I always feel like I need to hold them here. Like Vanna White. I'm a Vanna White librarian. But when he talks about the self, here are the inspiring ideas to take. When he talks about the self, he's talking about how we understand our purpose for living. What's the purpose of life? What is the good life? How do I understand myself in relationship to others and the world? This question shifted greatly between the pre-modern and modern man. We used to be encounterers. We used to be wanderers. We used to be students of creation. We used to think that if the outside cosmos around us were ordered, our inner world needed to be ordered to them. There was virtue, and there was a deep understanding that you needed to change. You were probably the problem. And so you needed to pattern your practices, engage with the ideas, learn to be like the hierarchy and order of goodness. That's not how we understand things today. I think you probably are going to know a lot about the things about the modern man, but we actually don't understand that anymore. We now have this idea of expressive individualism, where what's inside me is very true. It's very good. You can't tell me. Who are you to tell me that it's not good? And so we now live in a very different world. And when it comes to how we educate, the answers to those questions, what is the good life? What is the purpose of living? How do I understand how I relate to others? is very different in a classical education. We're still trying to maintain that you are not the source of goodness. You need to change. Your loves need to be ordered directly. You need to be restored. You need to sit humbly at the throne of God and study all that you can through creation so that you might become more like him. It's very different, but that is a foundational element of a Christian classical education that makes it very different than a modern education. Even if you are a Christian family using modern education, they do not mix the same way. Now, one more thing out of this, because I really love it, and it's great because he takes from Charles Taylor, and this way you don't have to read A Secular Age, which is great, and you should, but it's really big, like this big. He talks about Taylor's idea of the social imaginary. And the social imaginary is really important because it's how common people interpret images to understand their social surroundings. This is done through stories, legends, images, but they're usually agreed upon by most people. Not a little bit of people, not a small group of people, but most people. And because they're agreed upon by most people, they then inform the practices that are considered appropriate or good for society. That's why every older generation looks down at the one below them and is like, I cannot believe people are doing this in public, or I can't believe this is on TV, or I can't believe what kids are reading these days. We would have never read that during my time. It's because you had an agreed upon image of your social surroundings, how you were to move in them, what was appropriate, and then what practices were allowed. And so now we are dealing with a whole new set of images and practices that I would argue are not humanizing and are not leading us towards virtue. And so we need to understand that classical ed answers those questions very differently, gives a very different cosmic imaginary. Instead of seeing the world as a machine, we see it as a symphony, and that actually really changes how you educate and how your child ought to grow up and move in the world. So next is one of my very favorite books, and that would be George Eliot's Middlemarch. Now, I've talked about this before, but I actually have a lot of crossovers with my books on my list because ideas are connected and I connect them and then I like them and I want to talk about them from a new angle. So for Middlemarch today, the point I want to bring out, or the thing I want you to maybe be interested in, is that this shows a changing social climate and all of the tensions that come out of it. If you are a classical Mason mom right now, you are feeling tension with the surroundings in your world, most likely. And so this is a great book about how virtue can shift, how it becomes more individual, how what you want as the good life no longer meets the objective standard, but becomes very materialistic, frivolous, selfish, things like that. And then what happens to the people. And I really like when a book shows you the real, true, painful consequences of things like that, and also the sometimes painful in process, but deeply satisfying life of virtue. And Middlemarch is witty. It's so well written, but George Eliot, not her real name, she does not get the type of credit for her wit and ability to develop characters and describe them that Jane Austen gets, but I think they are equally matched. Okay, in case you're worried they're all gonna be like really old or really hard books, they are not. Old is not the goal, even though most good things are old. It's the old truths that I'm after. And so this is actually a newer book. This is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I've talked about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell before. This is the same author, just a very differently sized book and totally different than you were expecting if you read Jonathan Strange and fell in love with the fairy world. However, Paranasi is amazing. There's a man who lives in a house that loves him. And sweet Paranasi, which is not his name, but what someone else calls him, is the perfect picture of the pre-modern man. He lives in a place that he believes is transcendent. The house cares for him and he loves it in return, and his love means he studies it. He cares for things. He gives respect and honor and true worth to the things that are good. And it's very relational between him and his surroundings, his world. There's a point where Piranesi, I don't want to ruin it. I just want to say that Susanna Clarke does an excellent job in her use of language. So when she is talking about the modern world, she'll use very digital tech computer language, like the night sky or the night air looked pixelated by the raindrops. Pixelated is a screen, not man's vision. And so she beautifully goes through and changes language in different parts of the book to show what it's like to be the modern man and what it's like to be the pre-modern man. And what's really fascinating is the entire time you are meeting Piranesi, or at least if you're like me, you love him, like you really adore him, but you can't help thinking how naive he is. Oh, this poor guy. Keeps running through your mind, but what does that reveal? about you. How modern are you? How much of the enchanting world have you lost? This book will help you answer that question and help you see the difference in how one encounters the world. And classical education sincerely requires a true spirit of encountering, of worshiping, of being amazed and in awe. It requires that you sit under the night sky and you're taken in by it. You are not mastering nature, whether that be the literal creation or yourself. Instead, nature pulls you in. It changes you. That's really important in classical education. It's distinct and very different than the modern education of how we use resources, both literally in the classroom and around us in our world, and what role man has in the world. Are we supposed to be students? Are we supposed to use things to further advance whatever it is that we want in that time and place? Okay, this nice little book is called Humility by Andrew Murray. Humility, I don't usually hear that talked about in modern education. I don't know if anyone's directly worried about cultivating humility in our students. We do a number of things in modern education that inflame desires we really shouldn't. We do rewards, we do grades, we do competition. We use things like unit studies. We overuse material, we misuse material. We make something like Robinson Crusoe into 45 different math lessons, geography lessons, literature lessons, handwriting lessons, when that story is one about repentance and honoring your parents. It's not about how do you build a ship. If you want to learn how to build a ship, you don't pick up Robinson Crusoe. You do something else. So in humility, which is what we are trying to achieve in classical education, this book will give you lovely living ideas about humility. It will draw you into repentance. It will make you want to cultivate humility so that you can grow godliness. That is the heartbeat of a classical education. You do want to cultivate humility because it's only through the fear of the Lord that you can ever meet wisdom, that you can ever know Lady Wisdom, that you can ever grow in stature to become wise. Humility is never listed as an objective in your state curriculum. It's just not. We put a lot of emphasis on things like we're going to be world changers, or they're super strong-willed for what they believe in, or they're going to be creative or leaders, different things like that. We don't talk about being lowly. It's not a thing that comes up in modern education, but it is something that should be coming out of your classical education. I know that classical ed can have a very snobby, elitist reputation, and I think that's very wrong and means that things have not been done well. But ultimately, this is the goal. You want a humble adult at the end of a classical education, which is going to extend their entire life, but you know, the formal lessons too. Okay, couldn't be a book list without some C.S. Lewis, and of course we have some more on this list as well, but this is The Abolition of Man. I think every educator needs to read it every single year. It's my favorite. Everyone, I think, you know, all the Christians love C.S. Lewis. A lot of the non-Christians do too, but he can really scandalize you if you're not ready for it. So from The Abolition of Man today, I want to talk about objectivity, which is something that is quickly leaving the modern education because it's very hard to say anything is objectively true. I mean, even to down, like, you used to think math was a safe subject, right? 2 + 2 is 4. Apparently that's not a thing anymore. I remember learning about something that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing. I can't remember the formal title of it, but they're basically changing maths. Oh, maybe it's equitable math. That might be what it's called. So you get points even if you get the wrong answer, depending on your life circumstances. Math is objective. It's not a thing we can mess with. But in The Abolition of Man, he actually talks about objectivity and beauty. That's the idea we're gonna pull out. There's so many ideas in this one, but that's the one. Because without beauty, there is no courage. And he talks about this idea of men without chest, that we want old world order, but then we're surprised to find out that we don't have it anymore. And I think that part of that is that we no longer recognize an objective standard of beauty, that everything is not relative. Your taste, maybe as a small child, but maybe as a 30-year-old in America today, does not necessarily mean it's good. Just because you like it doesn't mean it's the best. In fact, you have to be taught what is the best and how to love it. And so that is something very important in classical education. We are constantly studying the appetitive taste, the moral examples, the imagery, the narrative language, different things like that, so that our children are always engaging with what is the best. We can't live only on the best. We also just need common goodness, but we don't want the counterfeit, the mediocre. And right now, modern education is constantly pulling in these new books, these new ideas that are very ephemeral, they're fads, they're trendy, they're not going to last. And in a classical education, you're trying to pick what will last, what has stood the test of time, what is actually objectively good and beautiful, because that is what forms the imagination, it's what forms the loyalties, it's what grows that virtue in your heart, because your chest is a magnificent part of a person, and we are mutilating the chest in modern education. Wow, I'm really coming out hotter than I intended to today. Okay, so next one is Logic of the Body, and this is by Matt LaPine. This is actually a book about retrieving a theological psychology, and it's really good. It's pretty heavy. It's very academic. I've been told he's writing a layperson's version, and I hope he does, and that would be great because this book is excellent, but it is very academic, and the footnotes alone can really send you down some rabbit trails. But he's talking about how Reformed theology, Reformed Christian Protestant theology has shaped counseling and vice versa in a bit, and how it's basically fragmented the person in a way that's really unhelpful. And so we either think something like anxiety is like a spiritual issue and you just need to pray more, or we think it's only a bodily issue and so you just need to be medicated, and we miss the holistic part of a person. I think this is a perfect example of how the modern world tries to put band-aids over problems and fails to see a whole person. Our education system fails to see a whole person. It does not, to the point of Abolition of Man, see that there's virtue that needs to be cultivated in the studies. Now, I do want to say there are, of course, Christian parents who use modern education systems that 100% are thinking about that and are trying to do that for their children. But I'm just speaking as the system itself does not include that. This is like primary, basic, foundational stuff in a classical education, that you are training and forming an entire person, not just a mind, not just a body, not just the spirit. All of it has to be engaged because God made us as a whole being to move in a whole way in his world. And so while this is not a book about education at all, it is an excellent book about how the person works. And the idea I'm gonna pull is about the imagination. I did not anticipate this coming when I was reading. He is talking about the imagination and how important it is and how we respond to what happens around us, how we process. Basically, he's talking about the moral imagination, how we use the images that we know in order to create metaphors to understand our circumstances in our lives. What story do we tell ourselves? What role do we think we play? And he pulls from Thomas Aquinas, who has multiple parts of the imagination and of the gut, basically. And that unconscious part is what moves first before your rational brain ever clicks on to process or to understand what is happening, whether it be anxiety, depression, fear, joy. It's first your image of the good life, basically. That's very classical. I talk about that all the time. And this book will help you connect that to what the body is doing, what the mind is doing, how you form those inner quiet affections and loyalties, which will shape the mind is doing, which will change how the body moves. It's very interesting, and it will give you kind of a nice little primer on how your child was designed and then how they move in the world and how you can help support that. Because again, that whole personness is a huge part of classical education, and it's your role as a mother teacher to support your child in all those parts. And then lastly, we'll close out with C.S. Lewis here. This is Till We Have Faces. I was just talking about this in another book video, but I love this book. I really love this book. There are a couple of characters here that Lewis is really pivoting against one another. One is a very modern, he's a Greek philosopher. He's very rational. He's very easily able to disprove the spiritual priest who's like kind of grody. He's able to disprove all of the supernatural things that they believe, all the spiritual things. He's very much grounded in truth and reason, the logos. Then you have the priest who, while kind of grody, has a sense of mystery, of the supernatural, of the mystical. And what Lewis is doing is pitting them against one another for our primary character in the book. And in doing that, he's showing this war that exists, but he's also showing ultimately by the end what transcends both and is actually a whole picture of both the immaterial and the material, the supernatural and the natural. But one thing that I want to say that's very scandalizing from Lewis is that the modern Christian actually needs to become a really good pagan before they're a really good Christian. And what he means by that is the pre-modern pagan had a very nuanced sense of reality, that there was the mystical and there was the natural. There was the stuff you couldn't see and the stuff you could see, that the stuff you could see pointed to the things you couldn't see, that within them they held some of the things you couldn't see. It's a lot of stuff. I'm not saying go full pagan, everything was perfect, but I am saying that the modern Christian is so rational in their faith. And then if you add in our modern education system, which is so rational in what we call truth, that you completely chop a kid's knees off. What they need, like we talked about in our fairy tale video, is that sense of the other, of the greater reality, of the truer than true. And so by becoming a really good pagan first, Lewis thought then you could actually be a really good Christian, because the modern world was chopping out everything that was kind of weird about the church or weird about faith that's integral and important to the faith, to the church. And so that will never happen in modern education. That is another foundational leg of classical education being built on that pre-modern view that we can hold these things in tension, that there is no secular sacred divide. Because when you do math in classical education, math is a thing of God. You are becoming more like God when you do math well. When you are in the modern education world, you are doing math, it is proved, without God. It's not relate to God. God is a thing you do privately. I've talked about this before with the Enlightenment. Religion, faith became personal, and you needed to keep it at home. The marketplace, the social sphere, that's just for the stuff that we can prove with our five senses. And that's all we can agree on is true. And what does that do over the course of an education? Well, I will leave that question with you. I hope you enjoyed these books. I do feel like I got a little more intense than I intended to, but I really believe that classical education is not an option on the table in education. And I do think Mason is classical. So if you're new here, that's actually something I've described on my podcast and in a bunch of different videos. I do think she's part of the tradition, but it's not just one of many options. It is a completely different framework of education, different end goals, different methods of getting there, different views of what a person is, what the good life is, why we were created and what we're supposed to be doing, how we encounter God's world, how we steward the things given to us rather than use them for our own ends. It's just a different world. And so hopefully reading these books this summer allow you to see the major differences and stay the course. Continue to live a little odd, or be like the fox, like Wendell says, who leaves a bunch of tracks in the wrong direction, so it appears like you've lost your mind because you're pursuing things that are no longer understood as common, but we can make them common again. So my name is Autumn. Thanks for being here, and I will see you next time.